So one of the very important questions to ask is that really true, or is this simply myth and fantasy?
Well, myth and fantasy for me.
In your world, where is justice?
That Jesus was born of a virgin, that Jesus walked on water, that he turned water into wine, that is palpably anti-scientific.
Is it true or not?
Yeah, that is the basic question. It is completely irrelevant if it's comforting, if it gives you hope, if it gives you happiness. That has nothing to do with whether it's true.
That I agree with entirely.
Has science buried God? Mathematician John Lennox thinks not. But the old cultural Christian himself, Richard Dawkins,
I call myself a cultural Christian,
has something to say about it. Let's jump into the greatest debate on atheism ever recorded today on Indie Thinker. Welcome to the show. My name is Reed Uberman. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Today our show is sponsored by our friends over at Sailor Ridge. If you're looking for a beautiful, picturesque vacation for you and your family, you do not want to miss fall in the picturesque North Georgia Appalachian Mountains. And you can view that and enjoy all the amenities that they have to offer at Sailor Ridge by going right now to sailorridgetreesort.com. And when you check out, make sure to use the promo code indiethinker10, not only for a discount, but to let them know that Indie Thinker sent you. Now, I was very skeptical that Dawkins would do anything to prove that science has buried God in a debate between him and John Lennox. I'm happy to report that afterwards, I fully repent. I repent because I was wrong. I'm now a true believer. I am no longer skeptical. And I am firm in my belief that Dawkins did absolutely nothing to further that agenda. Now, in all sincerity, I really do think that the debate is great and that there were compelling points on both sides, but honestly, Dawkins did not prove his point. Now, maybe you would say that Lennox didn't prove that God exists, but Dawkins certainly didn't prove that God doesn't exist. There's a lot of things that Lennox brings up that we all should have to grapple with from the perspective of theism and specifically Christianity if we're going to be honest about the subject. But here's the real problem. I find that very few people are actually either informed on the topic or honest about the topic, and therefore it doesn't yield the kind of great results that we see in a debate between John Lennox and Richard Dawkins, because it's quite robust and there's a lot to talk about. So let's break it down and jump into the conversation now.
I believe the universe is rationally intelligible because there's a creator God behind it. Now, how do you account for the rational intelligibility of the universe?
Well, John, you said that I believe that the universe is a freak accident, which is the opposite of what you believe. For many years, for many centuries indeed, it seemed perfectly obvious that it couldn't possibly be a freak accident because you only had to look at living creatures, the sort of magnificent diversity we see in this museum, and everything looks designed. And so it was clearly preposterous to suggest that it was due to any kind of freak accident. Darwin came along and showed that it's not actually a freak accident, but nor is it designed. There's a third way, which in the case of biology is evolution by natural selection, which produces a close imitation of something that is designed. It's not designed, we know that now, we understand how it happened, but it looks very designed. Now, the cosmos hasn't yet had its Darwin. We don't yet know how the laws of physics came into existence, how the physical constants came into existence, and so we can still say, is it a freak accident or was it designed? The analogy with biology might discourage us from being too confident that it's designed, because we had our fingers burned before the 19th century in thinking that biology, which looks so much more obviously designed, that we got our fingers burned there. Now, in the case of the cosmos, freak accident or design, the point that I've made over and over again is that even if we don't understand how it came about, it's not helpful to postulate a creator, because the creator is the very kind of thing that needs an explanation.
Well, this is where I'll disagree, obviously, with Richard Dawkins, and I'll say that Darwin didn't actually solve the tension with the origin of life, and we are just now trying to figure out the origin of the cosmos. All Darwin actually did was posit how there might be evolution within a species and then tried to broaden out his his research to suggest that there might be within that a answer to how all life came to be. But here we are sitting in the present many years after Darwin, and we still don't know where life came from or how the process of evolution even began in the first place. So evolution doesn't actually take away the need for a creator, because you could always ask where that evolution came from. Where did that process come from? Is such an intricate and detailed process really something that just happened on accident? Is it really a third way? So Albert Einstein has something good for us to hear in the present, which is what they're talking about here. Is the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is its comprehensibility. Well, I think that that's a brilliant thing to admit to, that it is crazy to think that we can make sense of all of these things and that there is intelligibility in all of it. What is more incomprehensible is that you could think with all of that intelligibility that it just happened by accident. So I think Lennox is going to get down to a little bit more of the point here, regardless of what you think about evolution and what you think about abiogenesis and the fact that we really don't know how life began or how the cosmos began, and that we need a causal agent for all of that. I think more to the point, we have to ask the question, is it true? Which is what they'll start to debate a little bit more substantively.
In your world, where is justice to be found?
Well, justice is a human construct of great importance in human affairs, and it's something that we have, most of us have a sense of, which I think probably can be given some sort of Darwinian explanation, but I don't see where you're taking this.
Well, my question is there any ultimate justice? You see, you say this is petty. I'm saying I find myself in a world which is a broken world. I find myself in a world where there's massive injustice, where many people won't get it. We're so privileged, we live in Oxford and so on, we've got enough money to live on, etc., etc. But if there is no God, then there's no ultimate justice. And one of the things that the resurrection transforms for me from pettiness right into center stage is, if this is true, then there's real hope that there be a rational evaluation and fair justice at the end of the world. But atheism doesn't give you that.
Okay, suppose there is no hope, suppose there is no justice, suppose there's nothing but misery and darkness and bleakness, suppose there is nothing that we would wish for, nothing that we would hope for. Too bad. That doesn't make it true, just because God would make us feel good.
Well, of course it doesn't.
Well, then why do you bring that argument up?
Because I believe that there is evidence that it is true. I don't believe in the resurrection just like that, because faith is based on evidence.
You've changed your ground again. What you said before was that there is no hope without God, and it sounded...
Well, that's true. That's absolutely true, and you just admitted it. So
I haven't admitted it. I said, if that's true,
yes.
So what? I didn't say it was true. But anyway,
but therefore
if that's
the question
true, so what?
to be decided then is there a God, and has he revealed himself? And that's where, again, I think this pettiness needs to be pushed aside, because I can't get to know you as a person. You're not just a scientific object. I could look at you through a telescope or a magnifying glass. I could even dissect you and so on and so forth. But because you are a person, I cannot get to know you unless you're prepared to reveal yourself to me. So the fact that the claim of Christ to be the truth, to be God incarnate, that makes perfect sense to me, because if there is a God who invented this wonderful, marvelous universe with all its science and all the rest, then he has taken the initiative in getting to know us and revealing himself to us. And he's revealed himself to us at the level we can understand. We're persons, he's a person. That at least makes sense. So one of the very important questions to ask is that really true? Or is this simply myth and fantasy?
Well, myth and fantasy for me.
Yeah, well, do you know, that disturbs me for the following reason. Reading your book, The God Delusion, you say that it's under scholarly dispute among historians that Jesus actually existed. Now, I checked with the ancient historians. That is not so. And it disturbed me. History is not natural science. But what I don't understand is this, why you would write something like that.
I don't think it's a very important question whether Jesus existed. There are some historians, most historians think he did, some
They
historians
certainly
don't.
do. I couldn't find an ancient historian that didn't.
Well, there are one or two, but I don't really care, actually, because precisely because it's petty. I mean, if you could possibly persuade me that there was some kind of creative force in the universe, there was some kind of physical, mathematical genius who created everything, the expanding universe, devised quantum theory, relativity, and all that. You could possibly persuade me of that. But that is radically and fundamentally incompatible with the sort of God who cares about sin, the sort of God who cares about what you do with your genitals, the sort of God who is interested, who has the slightest interest in your private thoughts and wickednesses and things like that.
Okay, so Richard Dawkins thinks that the gospel and the story of Jesus is petty and that the resurrection is petty. That's fine. Richard is entitled to his opinion about any number of issues. However, what he isn't entitled to is the belief that he already actually said that he would agree to. If God does exist, then the story is pretty useful and pretty powerful, but since God doesn't exist, it's all petty and ridiculous. However, Lennox goes further and puts Dawkins' feet to the fire by saying, listen, if the resurrection is true and there is life after death, then you cannot, by nature of that very fact, call it petty. You don't have to believe that the resurrection is true. What you have to admit to is that if the resurrection is true, it is fundamentally not petty, because a dude getting up out of a grave, kind of not that petty. But also, Lennox drills down a little bit further and he shows us that ultimately the resurrection leads us to another idea that is ultimately not petty, which is ultimate judgment and ultimate justice as a result of that judgment. In other words, if there is life after death, there is room for ultimate justice in the afterlife. Now, the reason this is important is that we have to admit that justice is nothing more than a social construct here on this earth. That the person who has their child taken from them at an early age because of some sick murderer is never going to necessarily find justice, even if that murderer is sent to jail for what they did. Because there is no way to really repay the individual who has lost that loved one, poured tens of thousands of dollars into that child, and also poured hours into helping that child become the man or the woman that they're supposed to be, because men and women actually exist. So the point is that that's not real justice. That's just the best that this world can offer. Therefore, if there is no real justice, it is conceivable that the only option you have in this world is to live according to the fact that there is no justice, and then that would ultimately lead you to a life of nihilism and purposelessness, and you would say nothing ultimately has meaning, therefore I'm not going to try to pretend that it does. I'm actually just going to live logically, consistently, according to my atheistic worldview that says that there is no ultimate justice. You would do exactly what Raskolnikov does in Dostoevsky's novel. You would kill, and then you would find out, just like he did, that actually, well, there is meaning to this life, and that you can't wash the stain of guilt off of your soul because there is something bigger at play. All that to say this, that you cannot say Christianity is petty if true. That is something you cannot do. Now, obviously, you can say Christianity isn't true, but in order to say that, then you're going to have to undermine the evidence for Christianity. And this is the beautiful point that John and Richard come to toward the end of the debate. Whether you think it's petty or not, doesn't matter. Whether you think it's meaningful or not, doesn't matter. What truly matters, is it true? Here's where Lennox will take the debate with Dawkins.
What's that? That's a typical Freudian explanation, but one's atheism could be exactly that. A flight away from the reality that there is a God. So we're back to the question, inevitably.
We need the evidence.
We need the evidence. And what I'm suggesting to you is that we do have evidence. We have it in science, part of God's revelation. And I believe this building was probably dedicated to the glory of God.
No, it wasn't actually.
Wasn't it?
No.
Oh, right. Okay.
Rather the reverse.
Well, Oxford University, where we
That's
get
going back a few centuries there.
The Lord is my light and my illumination is the base of it. And there was that wholeness of life. And it seems to me that by truncating everything and putting it into the science basket, so to speak, that I get the impression that you're not taking history really seriously. Otherwise, you'd interact with it. And I'm trying to get to the basis of why that is so, because you regard what Jesus has done and who he is as petty. And I find the contrast between standing tall in a silent and cold universe with no hope, believing that your moral sense must ultimately be illusion. You're crying for justice because most people will never get it, because death ends everything. The contrast between that and enjoying the friendship, the personal friendship of God, and knowing that ultimate justice will be done, is immense.
Well, of
but
course
the basic
it is.
question is it true or not?
Yeah, that is the basic question. It is completely irrelevant if it's comforting, if it gives you hope, if it gives you happiness. That has nothing to do with whether it's true.
That I agree with entirely.
So we need to know whether it's true.
Yes.
Now, when you look at history, and let's leave aside, maybe I alluded to the possibility that some historians think Jesus never existed. I take that back. Jesus existed. However, if you're going to say that Jesus was born of a virgin, that Jesus walked on water, that he turned water into wine, that is palpably anti-scientific. There is no evidence for that. And if there were, you would be, well, I mean, no, there simply isn't any evidence for that, and no scientist could possibly take the idea seriously.
I can make it worse for you.
I know you can.
Because Jesus actually claimed to be the Logos that created the whole universe. And if this is the Creator incarnate, making water into wine and so on is really a triviality. The more fundamental thing is the fact that he claimed to be and gave evidence that he was God. When you say it's anti-scientific, I don't think it's anti-scientific at all. Science cannot say that miracles do not occur. It can say they're highly improbable. The question is, of course, did such a thing ever happen? And the central focus in the New Testament is not that, which is not so readily accessible to evidence, the virgin conception, but the resurrection of Christ. And ancient historians, and this has fascinated me recently going over it, ancient historians whose discipline is very venerable, and I'm not talking about Christian ancient historians, ancient historians, many of them, even at the skeptical end of the spectrum, say that the evidence for the resurrection of Christ is very powerful. The explosion of the Christian church from a non-proselytizing group of Jews in the first century, the empty tomb and all the rest of it, has even led Geza Vermesh, who's one of the most distinguished ancient historians in Oxford, to say, yes, this tomb was empty, and hallucinations and this kind of explanation do not wash. So we have to ask ourselves, are we prepared to believe in historical testimony or not?
Well, you must talk to different historians than the ones I talk to, but in any case, I still come back to the point that you cannot do science if at any time you remember that famous cartoon of the...
Oh, I do. And therefore a miracle happens in the middle of the equation, yes.
I mean, that is deeply against the spirit of science. And I don't think I could do science if I thought that at any time something like the resurrection, something like the virgin birth was going to be smuggled in by a godly caprice.
So once again, it doesn't matter if Richard thinks that Christianity is petty. That seems to be more of an ad hominem attack rather than an actual intellectual statement, to be sure. But this is very common for atheists today. And this is why I like this debate so much, because Lennox is so stinking polite that Dawkins can't merely jump into the ad hominem game and just talk about how stupid Christianity is and you believe in sky fairies and spaghetti monsters. No, actually Richard has to contend with the arguments of Lennox because they are so robust. But it does come back to the point where You cannot just merely say that Christianity is petty and dismiss it, nor can you say it is meaningful and dismiss it. What you actually have to do is get into a substantive argument on the evidence for the Christian faith. Now, I think this is most pronounced in the fact that Lennox continues to push the conversation to his own personal experience with Jesus Christ. Now, you could deny that, but honestly, I think that this is something that we don't talk about enough. If Jesus is merely an argument, then we can banter back and forth about this thing all day. But if Jesus is self-referential and revelation exists, well, then you can experience it yourself. And I would argue that he is, because that's exactly who the Bible explains Jesus to be. But even if you don't take me up on that very powerful promise, you need to grapple with the real evidence for Christianity, because we all know that truth is not necessarily a 100% verifiable thing that we operate in. In other words, when you get up in the morning and you say you're going to go to work, is that a true statement? Well, it is true, at least in terms of intent. You are placing your faith in a couple of things that you think are verifiable, or at least have enough evidence to lead you to a conclusion. In other words, you are taking a presuppositional belief based upon some limited evidence that you have. You got in your car yesterday, it was working just fine. It's this year, make, and model, so it's pretty reliable. And all of that evidence leads you to the conclusion that your engine will turn over when you start. But nobody opens up the hood, looks at the engine, makes sure the pistons are firing, has enough oil, all that stuff before they start their car every single morning, because that is not the way truth actually works on a practical basis. So in other words, we are all making assessments of what is true on a faith basis with evidence. So when the atheist comes along and says that belief in God is faith in the absence of evidence, they don't know what they're talking about. Faith is exactly the thing the atheist has and the thing the Christian has. We have this in common. Faith is placing a belief in something based upon evidence. Can I prove to you that God exists? No, I cannot. Can the atheist prove that God does not exist? No, we cannot. But what we can do is we can have a conversation about where the evidence takes us, and then be honest enough to let the evidence lead us there. So that's why I bring up things like the moral argument. There is no such thing as objective moral values if God does not exist. There is no arbitrary subjective moral value that can tell you that it is always wrong to murder an innocent baby. No, you have to have objective moral values. But to have objective moral values, you cannot have arbitrary values based upon your culture and your personal feelings and your personal beliefs. There has to be an idea, a transcendent idea outside of that says innocent human babies are actually valuable and deserve to be protected. There needs to be a truth that transcends your arbitrary moral standards. So in other words, when you start talking about transcendence, you get in fully into the realm of the religious. I would love to know where transcendent moral values come outside of a transcendent moral law giver. Now, by the way, I might also mention that Richard Dawkins actually, when he was pressed about where his moral code comes from, I bet you can't guess where he said it comes from.
What's your moral code? I suppose it's a version of the Golden Rule.
That's right. Richard Dawkins has to appeal to moral religious values in order to develop a moral life. This is why he called himself a cultural Christian, because he knows very well that you cannot lead yourself to objective moral values from atheism. No, he has to appeal to religions like Christianity and the Golden Rule. And by the way, yes, I would argue that what Dawkins just said is a Christian value. Now, you have the silver rule from Confucius before Jesus that says, do not do to others what you do not want them to do to you. But Jesus takes that and he creates the golden rule, which is do unto others what you would have them do unto you, and kind of puts a positive twist on it. All that to say that the religious values that even Dawkins has to eventually come from religious ideas. You cannot truly take your own personal preferences and then from that work your way toward a moral society that treats everybody with intrinsic value, because you're only using your personal preferences. And then we also have things like the teleological argument that show us the fine-tuning of the universe. How in the world is it such that if we just move microscopic measurements, the Earth, off of its axis, that everything on Earth would die? I mean, you can think about the privileged place of our Earth among all the other planets in the universe. Of course, there are weirdos out there that posit the existence of extraterrestrial life, but they don't have any evidence for such a thing. No, the only life that we know of in the cosmos is in our planet. Isn't that oddly weird? It almost seems designed. And then, of course, you have biblical archaeology that shows things like the biblical Sodom exists, and that you can see fire burn marks from the top down on the buildings when they were excavated. And you can see that there were remnants of artifacts, of things that were burned in the Sodom site that seem to suggest that there were fires heated up to the point of an atomic bomb. That's right, there was trinitite found at the Sodom site, which is what happens to something once it has been burned so hot that it becomes kind of like a crystalline green, a green material. So there is archaeological evidence that consistently and continually proves that the Bible is true. In fact, I'll also inform you that there is not a single archaeological find that has undermined the veracity of the Scripture. So every single archaeological find when it comes to the Bible has only affirmed biblical truth and biblical dating. And then, of course, we have the resurrection. So what is the best explanation for the explosive growth of the Christian church in the first century? The resurrection is the best explanation for this, because how do you get a group of people who are so steadfastly dedicated to a fake sect that they know is not true, and they're willing to risk their life for that story that they know is not true, except that these people actually believed it was true because they saw an empty tomb, such that Peter and Paul and the other apostles were willing to risk their life in order to declare the story of a risen Savior. The empty tomb is indeed the best evidence for the rise of Christianity in the first century and beyond. So once again, you can say that it's petty all you want, but if true, it certainly isn't petty. And I would argue that whether you believe it's true or not, the one thing that you are going to have to grapple with is that the evidence for Christianity is overwhelming. By the way, you also have the historical Jesus, and at this point in time, there isn't a single historian on the planet worth his degree on the wall that would tell you that Jesus didn't exist. This is true of even Bible skeptic Bart Ehrman.
I know in the crowds you all run around with, it's commonly thought that Jesus did not exist. Let me tell you, once you get outside of your conclave, there's nobody this is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity.
All that to say, if you need religion for moral values, and you need a causal agent for the creation of this fine-tuned universe, and then you see archaeology that continues to affirm a biblical truth, and you see the resurrection as a plausible explanation for the rise of Christianity in the first century, that and so much more than we have time to go into, then it might be time to start grappling with the truth of Christian Scripture rather than just pushing it aside and saying, well, I went to church when I was a kid, and then I also studied religion when I went to college. Forgive me, but you are more likely to find a talking dog at college than you are a conversion experience to Christianity.
My name is Doug.
The truth is that you're going to have to study this stuff for yourself. And the one thing you cannot do once you have is say that the evidence for Christianity is purely trivial. In fact, it's so overwhelming that you can experience it yourself. And then once you do, you'll know that there's a resurrection, not only for Jesus, but for you in this life and the life to come. All right, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and go with God.